Continuo ad avere le mani sudate, anche nelle piccole presentazioni, perché per me è un motivo di piacere personale e onore che condivido con Paolo, con molti del board di ACT Italia, presentare non solo persone di elevato livello scientifico, elevata preparazione professionale, ma che negli anni e nel lavoro che abbiamo fatto insieme sono diventati dei veri e propri amici e con cui condividiamo tantissimi episodi di vita. Per cui non vorrei presentare Dennis Tirch per la parte scientifica che ascolterete e per la preparazione che ha e il lavoro che ha fatto insieme a Paul Gilbert, di cui ci parlerà, ma lo vorrei presentare come un eccellente musicista, un ottimo chitarrista, un vero performer, uno dei punti centrali delle Follies della CBS, senza il quale non si può fare, e come si usa con i musicisti, please welcome on stage Dennis Tirch.
So thank you very much, Donnie, particularly even for mentioning the guitar, which always makes me smile. And thank you to everyone involved with this conference, to ACT Italia, and all of you for being here. It's very exciting to see mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion as common processes we're going to target and we're looking at such a conference with such great attention and such great attendance, so many people who are here. And a few of you who were upstairs at the workshop that we just did with Lisa, Anna, and Katya, Giovanni. I began by saying a small question, so if this is repetition, I'm sorry. So how many people here identify as women? How many women are here right now? No, I don't identify as women officially. I'm not so lucky. So a lot of women. And there are two things that I'm extremely happy about being here, about this night, is that firstly, that I'm in Milan, in Italy, and secondly, that there are so many women here, because Italy is better than America, actually, in many ways, and is very beautiful, and women are, in fact, smarter than men. And this is a truth that we have to come to terms with. So part of what excites me about that, and my partner, Dr. Laura Silverstein, loves to show me every day that, women are a little bit smarter than we male human beings are. What excites me about this is that we're crossing boundaries and bridges that apparently divide us. We could be divided by language, we could be divided by culture, we could be divided by gender or religion or sexual orientation. But this group of people here tonight, that is not on the menu. We are being united by a common purpose. And that common purpose, to my mind, is the alleviation and prevention of human suffering and the contribution to human well-being. So if we can move past divisions in the way our bodies are shaped or the words we use, we also need to move past divisions that are artificially imposed in terms of the theoretical orientation that we operate from. I am an ACT therapist, and I am a CBT therapist, and I am a Buddhist psychologist, and I am a CFT therapist, and I am a grandson of a man from Calabria. And I'm honored to share breaking down those boundaries and turning to the science, because science and community and a sensitivity to context offers us so much more than a brand label. if we do ACT or FAP or the KGB or the CIA or any of that nonsense. We are here as psychologists, psychotherapists, and social scientists. So part of what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the evolution and the roots of psychological flexibility in cooperation, compassion, and in attachment dynamics. And some of these presentation materials are original, some of them are drawn from the CFT community pool of information, and some are drawn from the ACT community, because we're all in this together. We have, my partner Laura and I have a place in New York. If you're in New York, come by. The food isn't as good as here in Italy, but we'll be happy to host you. And our website is mindfulcompassion.com. So a lot of the material we're talking about, you can learn about there. So how many people attended Steve's wonderful plenary last night? Yeah, Steve is obviously a tremendous human being. As a founder of ACT and founder of RFT and of this community, he's an amazing guy. He's also like a deeply heartfelt and emotionally present individual. And it's pretty amazing what psychological flexibility offers us. Don't you think? I mean, what we can do with it. A good question is sort of why? What is psychological flexibility? Where does it flow from? What aspect of embodied human intelligence provides a context for the cultivation of psychological flexibility that's optimal? Let's discover that experientially today and intellectually, together. There was a teacher of mine, a mindfulness teacher, who used to say, a beginning is invisible. And let's approach this beginning together almost like a meditation. Almost like a meditation. If you wish, you could close your eyes. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you'd like to get in a mindfulness-like seat, that's fine. You could sit in a comfortable place or an uncomfortable one, whichever you prefer. But let's close our eyes for a moment and fall silent and fall still. And let's bring to mind where we are. Feel your weight on the chair. Your feet on the ground. Feel your back straight and supported. And notice even the top of your head. And as you breathe in, breathe attention into the whole body. Breathe attention into the body as a whole. Just resting in the breath. And let's ask ourselves this question together. When did this workshop begin for you? Did it begin when Nani gave this introduction? This plenary, this discussion, did it begin a few minutes ago? Or did it begin as part of the whole conference when your foot moved through the threshold when you first arrived here? And as if we had a thread through space and time, just charting your course through your life here on earth, we follow this thread back. Did it begin for you when you registered or saw the advertisement? Let's follow that thread back. Maybe our work together began when you were a student. Maybe we can follow that thread back even farther, holding yourself in kindness and resting in your breath, remembering a time when you were moved by the suffering of another person. Perhaps you were very young. Maybe an older person or a sibling. But at a certain time and space, your eyes met the eyes of someone who was suffering, and you wished to do something about it. Breathing in and feeling in the body where this motivation to care arrives. Following the flow of your breathing and connecting with a motivation to not just observe the suffering in the world, but to take action. Remembering a time recently when, with a client or a friend, you saw the burden they were carrying. Your eyes met theirs, and you were moved by their pain. And you deeply wanted to help, wanted to care, wanted them to live a life of meaning and purpose and vitality. So breathe into that together, connecting with this human experience that we share. And when you're ready, exhaling and releasing each breath slowly. Just resting in this moment. Having some gratitude for coming here, gratitude for choosing to be a therapist, to be a mental health professional. Knowing that you are surrounded by people here. Everyone in this room shares this motive, shares this heroic motive to do something about the suffering we share in this life. What better way to spend our time here on earth than to contribute to each other's well-being? Beautiful thing. So when you're ready, letting out a long exhalation, just breathing out. If you need to stretch a little bit like a cat, you can do that. Or open your eyes. Maybe take a look around at all these remarkable, heroic individuals who are here for Act Italia. This is really something else. And we'll begin to move. So you could feel this in your body. This is what you're designed by evolution to do. This is why you're here. We define in compassion-focused therapy a definition that Paul Gilbert has borrowed from the Buddha. He intends to return it to the Buddha when he sees him in a future life. The definition is a basic kindness with deep awareness of the suffering of oneself and other living things, coupled with the wish and effort to relieve it. And I want you to recognize that this is not an idea, it's not a new age phrase, it's not a concept, but it is a deeply embodied, evolved human motive. It is an aspect of your human intelligence. We see compassion as a multifaceted process that has evolved from the human caregiver mentality. That is a set of behavioral repertoires, some verbal, some paraverbal, and some that go in accord with earlier operant and associative learning principles. This multifaceted process involves a caregiver mentality that's found in human parental care and child rearing. And as such, compassion involves a number of emotional, motivational, and cognitive elements. Our mind can be organized by compassion, and we know from various streams of research that from the day we are born until the day we die, compassion and affiliative emotions will affect us on every level, from our heart rate variability to our immune system functioning, to levels of depression and anxiety, to prosociality, cooperative behaviors. Compassion, affiliation, and a profound appreciation of the we-ness of our human family will lead you to function better and be happier and healthier. I feel like I'm, like evangelizing slightly, but it's not because this is a religious tenet. It is because where the science takes us, we aim to follow. And the science is taking us in a very powerful direction. This is Samiling Monastery in Scotland. It's the first Kagyu Tibetan Buddhist monastery outside of Tibet. It was founded in the 70s by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And a lot of the work that Paul Gilbert in the UK did in developing compassion-focused therapy imagery comes from this tradition. But this is actually a tradition that involves mental training. It does not necessarily involve any supernatural assumptions. So when Paul works with monks or with Bob Leahy and I, or, we're deriving new ways of applying what Francisco Varela famously called an intrapersonal neurobiology, a phenomenology of transcendence. And we're applying that in a controlled way. And I think that has a lot to do with what we do in ACT, actually. It has a lot to do with what we do with psychological flexibility. We have this motive. May we find the way to help all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And let's build our wisdom from the evidence. Now, in compassion-focused work, we describe compassion as comprising two psychologies. This is very important, and it's not, again, not just an idea. It strikes to the heart of a human motive. So for 2,600 years, compassion has been described as a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. And this expresses itself in two ways. The first psychology is our ability to be aware of suffering in the present moment, to contact it and be sensitive to it, to be willing to engage and approach suffering directly. In ACT parlance, this is the acceptance component of a compassionate motive. The second psychology is our ability to work to alleviate and prevent suffering and its causes. That is the commitment component. So what I would like when you leave here today is for you to have an understanding that compassion is an evolved human set of behaviors. It's an evolved social mentality, as we'll see. And it involves a series of interacting processes. These are specific processes you can train in psychotherapy. This training can involve deliberate practice with you and with your patients. Shaping and other behavior analytic principles can help develop this practice, and there are specific treatment aims that relate to these processes. In shorthand, we experience wisdom, strength, and commitment when our minds are organized by compassion. It's evolved from protecting and caring social mentalities, and cooperation, compassion, and interconnection are intimately related to flexible responding. So this bit we're going to look at today is new. This is Paul Gilbert's work on social mentalities. It's new to the CBS community, but it's been around for quite some time in the CFT and evolutionary psychology community. And the idea of a motive, many of you who are of the behavior analytic and contextual behavior science orientation, hearing something like a motive can make us a little itchy, because it sounds like maybe it's like mentalization, creating mental constructs, reifying things. It's less about a functional model and more about a structural model. And that put me off for a very long time. But I want you to consider, when I use the word motive, we are talking about biosocial goals that arise through multi-level selection theory and inclusive fitness. Motives are related to expansive repertoires of behavior, actually, that serve an evolutionary function. Evolved motives, we're using motive as a shorthand for these clusters of behavioral imperatives. Just like we could say relational framing, and you're not going to go up in my head and find a little shop with men with wood making relational frames. All language is metaphor to some extent. So when we say motive, we're talking about evolved sort of patterns of inherently reinforcing perhaps not as freely chosen as values or establishing operants, but evolve motives for social relating and role formation that, again, involve pre-verbal, paraverbal, and verbal behaviors. These involve heritable pre-birth tendencies, and these are elaborated in every individual in their own learning histories. These mentalities, social mentalities that are forms of these motives, involve interactional dances and the co-regulation of our minds and bodies within social roles. So I remember watching this wonderful turtle, for an aside, we'll go over here to talk about the turtle. I was watching the way a turtle has so much pre-birth instinctive learning, complex patterns, because the way a turtle replicates is through dispersal, avoiding others, and mama turtle goes to the beach, she lays like 2,000 eggs, maybe 10 or 20 actually ever make it to the sea to be other turtles. So nurturance, social learning, and post-birth learning patterns, operant conditioning, is in many ways not as important to the turtle as it is just having these patterns. So you watch this infant turtle, newly hatched. It has nobody teaching it, but it knows how to make it to the sea, how to get to the ocean, how to move around. And it could seem cruel and cold to just imagine a human doing that. Well, I have a few kids, I leave them on a beach, I get back on the cruise ship. If they make it to the ocean, more power to them. We have a very different evolutionary history. We have a very, very different way of operating. So these social mentalities, they choreograph and pattern emotions and behaviors and cognitions according to how goal-seeking and role-forming has been reinforced in our individual lives. And they emerge in a constant process of blending, internal co-regulating, and give rise to states of mind. So here's a few examples. Care-seeking. Humans we've evolved to inherently seek care, to seek protection, to seek community. Caregiving. We have evolved to give care, to look after one another. Cooperative social mentalities are hugely important for human evolution, as we'll discuss. As Steve likes to remind us, we are the cooperative vertebrate. Cooperation affords an amazing evolutionary advantage. I think it's something like 2% of insect species cooperate with each other on any level, and they make up over 65% of the biomass of all insects. Our capacity for language and thinking, which is our chief evolutionary advantage, has, arguably evolved from a need to cooperate. Early proto-human primates to cooperate, look at each other, to look into one another's eyes, have a sense of theory of mind, mentalization, dyactic framing, and to be able to use language so that we would survive. So our cooperative and caregiving mentalities are extremely important to humans. We share some of these with earlier species. Obviously, we didn't invent sex, human beings. Other species reproduced that way. And we didn't invent competition. But these are very powerful motives. And they're very powerful motives that are reinforced by our culture very, very strongly. So we're going to think for a moment about attachment theory. So here's an absurd question. How many people here are familiar, at least to some degree, with attachment theory? Okay, put your hands down, please. Per favore. How many people believe that attachment theory is relevant to human development and functioning? Okay, we put our hands down. How many of us have spent time reading, researching, or seriously considering the relationship between attachment and psychological flexibility? I love you guys, I really do. Okay, so let's get clarifying our terms, because I think this is the fourth wave. This is where we're headed, man. This is like how we take ACT and CFT further. Attachment, good old Bowlby and his partner Mary Ainsworth, whose picture I don't have, and that might be sexist, and Laura's going to kill me now that she realizes that. But okay, J. Bowlby of Bowlby and Ainsworth. By the way, they created these theories in the context of a psychoanalytic community. And the psychoanalytic community had a very insulting term for them. Do you know what it was? Behaviorists. That's what they told them. They said, oh, you behaviorists, you're too, So if anyone ever says, they don't get to be described as behaviorists, they earned it, man. They were, really giving a hard time. So attachment is defined as the lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. And when we think about these social mentalities, connectedness, cooperation, and caring is essential for the development of this human phenomenon of attachment. But we don't just refer to attachment as attachment styles. Quite frankly, I'm not even interested in attachment styles. What I'm interested in is that pro-social and affiliative behaviors related to ourselves and others emerge from our attachment history. And attachment dynamics are major regulators of threat processing and functioning. And when I say regulators, that also is something that can be like, to CBS people, like we're not about regulating and coping. We're about being in the presence of difficult things and having the courage and flexibility to move towards valued aims, right? Well, what we're talking about in terms of regulating threat processing and functioning is to be able to persist towards a valued aim or break off from that movement forward on the basis of our appraisal of how likely that is to contribute to our survival. I don't even mean cognitive appraisal. I mean a holistic experience of sufficient stability and, in the face of threat that we can move forward. So I have had panic attacks. I have that in common with Steve, that and the baldness. We both have had panic attacks. Several of you, many of you, I know this already, have had panic attacks. And you can learn to deal with a panic attack, and you can learn to function, and it's a beautiful thing, and you learn that your anxiety isn't going to harm you, and we move forward towards lives of meaning, purpose, and vitality. However, no matter how acty I want to be, when someone is sufficiently terrified and paralyzed, that's trouble for them. Like, let's be realistic. If we all gave you like a sufficient, psychopharmacological dose of adrenaline or cortisol and then said, okay, now just move forward without defense towards that would be, we do have a threat system, a way of processing threat. I won't even go so far as to say fear, but our minds can be organized by compassion. They can be organized by threat. And when we experience secure attachment dynamics, a focus on literal attachment style is kind of a misnomer. What we're talking about is a set of behaviors in the face of fear, in the name of survival, a set of behaviors that involve the coordination and action of multiple instinctive systems and verbal learning artifacts. And the primary goal, the primary proximal function of these patterns of behavior is the maintenance in attachment history of proximity for an infant, proximity to the caregiver. We do not wish to be voted off the island. We do not wish to be alone. A lone monkey is a dead monkey. Our survival depends upon one another. That is how we've survived as a species. So in order for us to have sufficient stability, to experience courage, to move forward, to have flexibility, we need to have an experience of not being left absolutely alone. We need to know that there is someone present. And this develops into an ability to flexibly persist towards or break off from the pursuit of a goal based on this sort of homeostatic experiences that are related to our survival likelihood. So secure attachment dynamics show up as proximity seeking, desire for closeness or to be with, a secure base, seeing another or an internalized experience of another, sort of are responding to the imaginal representation of another, imparting the stimulus functions of the literal experience of another, if you will. A secure base, a safe haven, a source of comfort and emotion regulation, and social signals are the drivers of this. I'm going to take a little look at the time because we have so much to cover, and we've already covered so much, and we don't have that much time. How will we do this? This is interesting. I've got an idea. We're going to do a little magic trick. And the magic trick involves perspective taking. It involves us holding lightly all of our stories about where we need to go and where we were and being right here, right now. It means forgetting about our experience of linear time. Are you willing to do this little experiment with me? Let's see. Let's see. We're scientists. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to plan on covering everything I wanted to cover and giving you everything I've got to share. And I plan to do it in the next half hour, even though it's at least 6 weeks worth of material. So let's find out if we can do this together. And we're going to take a deeper look at all of this. And we're now going to bridge from the theory into a practical application, because this material now you can share with your clients. We're moving into a portion of compassion-focused work that we call the reality check, which means that we understand that our suffering is not alone and not our own, that it exists in an evolutionary context, that it exists in the context of our social history, and it exists in the context of the present moment. As the philosopher Alan Watts said in the early 1970s, we come out of the world, not into it. No, we don't just drop out of a cloud as a singular I. We're an emergent species in the flow of life, and our brains with their motives and their emotions and their response patterns and their arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding and all of this, right? These are products of evolution, and they've been designed by evolution to function in certain ways. So life apparently began on this planet hundreds of millions of years ago, billions of years ago, deep in the ocean, when iron and sulfur were moving around, and at a certain point, under conditions of extreme pressure, little circular bubbles from gas through the water started to form these little membrane-like structures. So all of a sudden there was an inside and an outside of something. And somehow material coalesced in the middle of that, so we had a cell that had a membrane and a nucleus. And when you get a membrane and a nucleus together, that's like red wine and the right pasta. Fabulous things happen with a nucleus and a membrane. Rather than just being a soup of other chemicals, the cell does something. If we looked at an amoeba under a microscope slide, we would see that the amoeba will move away from heat or a little poker or something. It'll move away from something that can harm it. And it will move towards things that sustain it. It'll move towards food. And after some time, cells began to work together. They began to form collectives so that they could more effectively move towards what sustained them and move away from danger. And over billions of years, in more sophisticated forms, we arrived. We arrived as collectives of cells. You're a collective. You're a community. There's millions and millions and millions of cells within you operating together. And they didn't just come out of nowhere. They evolved on this planet following principles of variation, selection, and retention to become better and better at living. And at a certain point, where it starts to get really crazy, organisms, collective cell sort of communities that were primates, began to need to carry food and go a long distance to eat the food, probably somewhere on the savannas. And they began to look into each other's eyes and communicate. And they began to be able to frame and derive relations of I, you, then, now, here, there. And they began to understand their experience as an I in the context of a you, a here in the context of a there. This is a very big deal because that means life on earth becomes self-aware. So all of a sudden, livingness that you're a part of becomes self-aware and can language and can learn from symbolic representation of the outside world. So you right now are taking in gases through your lungs and your skin, and that brain of yours, that beautiful brain that developed to accommodate all that thinking and languaging, Do you know that that is the most combinatorial complex phenomenon that we have seen in the known universe, probably quite likely? There are more discrete neuronal connections in your brain than there are stars that are visible in the sky or grains of sand on all the beaches in the world. So after billions of years, hundreds of millions of years of evolution, this amazingly complex, cascading aspect of the universe shows up that can think and know and feel and care and look after itself and advance. This universe, this 13.8 billion year universe, contributed to you. All the hard work that went into just you being here just now, moving towards what might sustain you and away from that which might harm you. And here's the tough part of this, right? Your life is short. Our lives are short. Maybe 25,000 to 35,000 days is a bargain. That's a long life. And our lives decay and end. And we're subject to various malfunctions and diseases in this crazy genetic lottery. Everything is impermanent. Every one of you, including me, we're all going to die, and everyone we love is going to die. And before they do, they're going to suffer tragedies, they're going to get sick, and they're going to get older. Whew. This is what I call the cheerful part of the conversation. But can you imagine why you would want to relate this to a client? Maybe you'd use different language. Maybe you wouldn't get all science-y about everything. But a client comes in, I've been in therapy, many of you come into therapy. When we're first in therapy, we're small, we're enclosed, we have stereotypical patterns of behavior, we're suffering, we know we're contributing to some of it, and we can't stop, and we blame ourselves. It's about me, I'm bad, I'm shameful, I'm so ashamed, I'm wrong. Well, to share this big picture, like Paul Gilbert has this beautiful way, I don't know if it'll translate to Italian, but it has this beautiful way of saying something terrible about life while being encouraging. He goes, oh, life is shit, just like this. Big smile on his face. And I learned a lot from that simple phrase, that actually life is very, very tricky. The social circumstances of our lives, over which we have no control often, have major implications for the kinds of minds we have, the kind of person we become, values we endorse, and the lives we live. So yesterday, we know that someone tried to murder some people for political reasons outside of the Houses of Parliament. And in my country, we frequently have, even more than terrorist attacks, we have mass shootings where people grab expensive, high-powered rifles and just murder lots of other people for no reason. And I used to talk about this in these kind of workshops or plenaries, and I had a slide that would say, talk about the recent attack. And then I'd do a talk 3 months later, and there would have been an attack a few days before that. And then I would do a talk a few months later, and there would have been a mass shooting a few days before that. So I discovered about 3 years ago that I could leave a slide in a talk on compassion that says, talk about the recent globally aware mass murder. That's where we are in our culture, in our global culture. Lots of wonderful things are happening. We can communicate through the internet. We can advance our science. We can share things. There's greater rights for the LGBTQA community. There's greater rights for women. So many beautiful things are happening. But we are stuck and mired in aggression and competitiveness and global capitalism that is so toxic. And every one of us, if we have a smartphone or a television or we go by billboards, each one of you is going to be assaulted with more images of sexual competition, of violence, of war, of threat. You're going to see more in the next week than generations of your ancestors would have ever been exposed to in small human communities. Your brain is not designed to cope with this huge amount of violent, difficult, competitive information. So when I heard about this thing happening in Westminster, and I thought of my friends in England who I love, who are my family, I was angry. I was angry. Can anyone here understand that, relate to that anger, right? But I also know something, and that is that if I were raised as a marginalized group and had had my friends and families' homes burned or bombed, I could be the guy who's the bomber or driving the truck. If I were raised in a violent drug gang in Burma or Colombia or Paterson, New Jersey, and my father was a hitman or a murderer or a drug dealer, I would probably not be a compassion psychologist. I would probably be a drug dealer or a murderer. And we know that 85% of the young men who grow up in drug cartels go into the family business. We do not choose our parents. We do not choose our evolutionary history. We don't choose the schools that we go to when we're kids. So much that shapes our behaviors is not of our choosing and is not our fault. Of course, we should take responsibility for the course of our lives. Of course, we want to freely choose values. Of course, we want to move forward to live more healthy, advanced kind of existence. But so much that's shaping who you are is so difficult. And our clients come through the door thinking it's their fault. It's their fault. I'm the loser. I'm a piece of shit. It's me. And that is a form of excessive social threat. They are fused with personal narratives that narrow their behavioral repertoires, that cause them to have fewer and fewer options. And when we bring them into a context, an interpersonal context, where we are de-shaming, de-blaming, and de-pathologizing, we're doing a lot more than changing cognitions. We're doing a lot more than acceptance. We're activating the aspects of their biology that allow them to feel stabilized and to feel socially safe. We know that under conditions of threat, real or imagined, our behavioral repertoires narrow. And we know that when we feel socially safe, when we feel secure emotional relationships, our behavioral repertoires broaden. So the activation of threat systems, threat kind of motives in the reptilian brain, coupled with this is an oversimplification of the brain, obviously, our human capacity for language, all of this changes. So let's take a little bit closer look at how that works. And we're doing okay on our magic trick. We're doing fine. Some of you have heard Steve do this little bit. I have a lot of freedom right now. I could stand over here. I could come out to this part of the stage. I could see my friend. I could sing a song to him. I could walk over to the bar and get a whiskey or something like that. That wouldn't be advisable. That would be bad. It would be irresponsible. But I could do it. If someone were to hold a gun to my head right now, where would my attention be? On the gun, right? And how broad would my attention and awareness and behaviors be? How many behavioral options would I have if the gun is to my head? Actually, very few. I would be all about protecting myself and not getting shot. So when we experience threat-based contexts, our attention and our behavioral repertoire is narrow. We know this. And ACT folks know this better than anyone. Through this amazing process of fusion, our internal experiences, our internal thoughts and feelings and imaginal stimuli exert their stimulus functions on us as if they were literal. So it doesn't have to be a real gun, does it? It doesn't have to be a real rejection. It doesn't have to be really that everyone at the party is going to hate me, or really that I'm going to get contamination from touching this, or that really that I'm going to be mugged or assaulted on the way home. If my mind and my learning history and my languaging sets me up to encounter that, I'm going to engage in avoidance, over-control, and suppression, and I'm going to have behavioral repertoires which are narrower, and I'm going to have rigid and inflexible repertoires. This is very different from zebras. Did you do the zebras, Nico? He did the zebras. This man knows his zebras. We like to say with our clients in CFT, we steal from Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Have Ulcers, that if we were a zebra, our threat system would slow down in about 10 seconds, but a human with a zebra with a human brain would be up all night thinking about the threat, thinking about the threat, thinking about the threat. Has anyone had any anxiety during this conference? Wow, this is the bravest group of people I've ever seen. Okay. How many of you was that anxiety feeling you had at any point, was it based on what was going on in your head versus going on in the real world? Like, your anxiety system is basically there to protect your life. I've never gone to an ACT conference, no matter how tough the audience and friends were, where I had to run for my life. This is yet to happen. This is a very welcoming community. But your nervous system, this part of you, anger, anxiety, disgust, all these kind of ancient imperatives to stay safe, those emotions and those behavioral repertoires designed around threat, they don't know this. This is a little map of what we call in CFT the three-circle model. And it's just a little reminder that our inner life, our biology, and our emotional, affective, motivational systems can be organized by threat-focused experiences, can be organized by seeking appetitive stimuli, by the dopaminergic system where we seek drive, excitement, and vitality. And we can also have our minds organized by that attachment dynamic where we experience contentness, social safeness, kindness, and soothing. And we know very well that when we activate these kind of secure attachment emotions, that people feel more secure and more safe. We know that in the therapy process research, the one variable that is most important for therapy effectiveness is the quality of the therapy relationship. So when you feel threat, when you feel depressed, when you feel anxious, how many people fill out a thought record and start thinking? That's nobody. Nobody does that. What do you want to do when you feel distress? Let's say you got some bad news, you got a setback. What is your urge? What are you compelled to? Sometimes people say drink or run away, but basically we want to reach out to one another. We want to connect. You want to call. We want to help each other. So we respond through the activation of the vagus nerve, the activation of the oxytocin vasopressin system, so that our affiliative and soothing emotions actually allow us to downregulate and be in the presence of threat. And this doesn't have to be a relationship that's all about others. It can also be your internal representation of helpful others, which works to activate emotional memories of soothing, neurophysiological networks, and experiences with self-affiliation and experience of being lovable. We know that the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, will engage the rest and digest set of behaviors, but also the tend and befriend set of behaviors, so that our experience of kindness, warmth, and protection allows us to deal with challenges and difficult experiences. But we don't soothe so that we can curl up like a kitten. We don't soothe so that we just feel warm and fuzzy. We soothe so that we achieve attachment and response flexibility. This is from Dan Siegel, who's not an ACT guy. He's not a CFT guy. He's not a FAP guy. He's a neuroscientist of attachment who's also studied mindfulness. And we know that attachment classification is not synonymous with pathology. When we think about attachment, secure attachment, self-affiliation, the mind is organized differently, and that we're provided with flexibility and adaptability with security. We know that when we can use social relationships or a focus on compassion, often this takes place in the therapy relationship or through deliberate imagery practice, we actually can engage prefrontal mediation of our emotional lives. And when the prefrontal mediation of functioning that arises with secure attachment dynamics shows up, We have an interface between automatic default mode operations of the central nervous system, and we experience neural processes that allow for flexible adaptations to shifting contexts and perspectives. This prefrontal mediation involves a coordination process involving our sensory, perceptual, and appraisal mechanisms. It enables new and personal, meaningful responses to be enacted. And it may allow us to approach life decisions, relationships, and a narrative response with self-reflection, a sense of perspective taking on past, present, and future contingencies. Now, when I started reading this in the attachment literature, in the neuroscience of attachment literature, my mind was pretty blown. Because this is precisely what we're targeting in ACT, is it not? So when we think about psychological flexibility, and the specific characteristics of psychological flexibility, if we're speaking in the marketplace of ideas with neuroscientists and attachment theorists and developmental psychologists and educational psychologists, we will see that we are not alone, and that we in the ACT community have a lot to offer in terms of specifically how to train the processes involved in adaptive, compassionate flexibility. And we have a lot to learn, because there are a lot of people who understand how this works. We're beginning to do research. We have very little. There's one study that it was a cross-sectional study that demonstrated that psychological flexibility was negatively correlated with attachment, anxiety, and attachment avoidance. We also know that mindfulness is significantly negatively correlated with attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. There's a lot of research, some that we've done, some that Stanislaw Mlicki has done in Poland, and Joe Cherokee's group in Australia, that shows that self-compassion and psychological flexibility are intensely highly correlated, and both have been demonstrated to serve a mediating function. Both psychological flexibility and compassion are highly negatively correlated with depression and anxiety. Both are involving regions of the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the insula in coordination. Both compassion and psychological flexibility contribute to greater neural integration when you're facing a challenge. So perhaps we can seat and situate our understanding of psychological flexibility within our understanding of the evolution of compassion, cooperation, and secure attachment dynamics. And perhaps that can be generative for future research and intervention. So as an example of this, and this, Nico Petrocchi was one of the authors on this. This relates to the evolution of our mammalian caregiving system. Same hormones, oxytocin, vasopressin, and the activation of the myelinated vagal nerves, part of the, lots of words here, man, as part of the ventral parasympathetic system. This allows us to connect and co-regulate. So what does this look like? And this, our magic trick is going okay. We have a few more minutes, which is pretty groovy. So this is good. This is good news. So 7 years ago, I was doing an ACT talk at that monastery, Samueling Monastery. Buddhist monastery asked me to go do a 3-day ACT-based retreat. And while I was doing it, I actually veered into CFT territory a little bit. And I demonstrated this map, which is in CFT, these are the attributes and skills of compassion. These are the 12 sets of behaviors that we cultivate in compassion-focused therapy, training, and imagery. And I was going through them because these are very important. These are from the literature, Tanya Singer, many other people's literature on altruism, empathy, compassion. People will reliably, when they are in their compassionate mind, they will have greater sensitivity. They will be more in contact with present moment contingencies. They will be more sympathetic. They will have a greater emotional, evocative, emotional perspective-taking response. They will have greater distress tolerance. They'll be able to stay with difficult experiences longer. They'll have greater flexible perspective-taking and empathy. They'll be less wrapped up in judgmental cognitions, and they'll have a motivation to care for well-being. Now, my partner in life and psychology and everything, Dr. Laura Silberstein, now Tirch. Then she was named Dr. Laura Silberstein. We were not even begun to proceed towards marriage. Laura takes lots of notes. She's doing it right now, actually. And she looked at this and she said, hey, Dennis, that's just like the hexaflex. Those are the act processes, man. That's what we do. And I was arrogant and said, that's not important. We're just swapping terms. That's just these terms. You know, it's not a big mid-level terms. And I walked away. And then a few months later, I was working in my office and I had a great idea. And my great idea was to notice that what are the qualities of this compassionate mind in action? Actually, oh my, when you're activating compassion, in this very moment, you're accepting the sad and the sweet. You're holding stories about what's possible. You're being the author of a life that has meaning and purpose for you, and you're turning in kindness back to... I looked at Kelly's words, and I thought, that's the description of compassion. And in fact, I looked at the hexaflex processes, and I said, my God, Laura, they're the same processes. And she looked at me and was just like, I can't believe you. And my penance has been to always tell that story when I introduce our model of compassionate flexibility. But if we look, we can see that if you are in contact with the present moment, you can be sensitive to the presence of suffering in the present moment. If you have an ability to have willingness and acceptance, you can tolerate distress to a much greater degree. If you can be defused from categorical, evaluative, judgmental statements, self-statements, you can practice non-judgment. Our capacity for flexible perspective taking that we develop through self as context contributes to our capacity for sympathy, empathy, and self-transcendence. And that, boy, I can't work this thing. This values authorship is related very much to our evolved imperative to have care for well-being. And that when we commit to compassionate behavior, it involves these commitment processes. So why is that important? Well, it's important for 3 reasons. The 3 really important reasons, and that was 7 years ago, and 2 of the 3 have already borne fruit. So one reason it's important, right, is that the ACT community can open itself to compassion-based intervention, and our international community of researchers, our basic theory of language and cognition, can be marshaled to better understand thousands of years of compassion practice across all cultures. That happened, and it's happening more and more, and you're a part of it. And the fact that Nani, you and Paulo and your wonderful group here have created a conference that's a mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion conference is a big deal. The second reason it's extremely important is that there is a corpus of evidence-based techniques that we can draw upon from ACT and FAP and clinical relational frame theory that has process data and that accords with our best understanding of the neuroscience of personal change. So if we can bridge compassion-focused work and ACT work, we can draw on all of that and the evidence base of compassion-focused therapy, which is an extremely strong process-based research, but not so strong an outcome-based research. And I was talking to Paul Gilbert while he had a gin and tonic and I had a glass of wine one day. We used to both talk about these things over wine, but apparently for health reasons, he's moved on to gin. Anyway, we were discussing the state of the CFT research, right? And he said, oh, we don't have that many outcome studies. We're getting ahead of the data. Nico, my dear friend, said, we're getting ahead of the data. We have a great process research, but we don't have the outcome studies. And I remembered a conversation I'd had about 16 years ago with another good friend, Steve Hayes, who was saying, well, I don't want to get ahead of the research. I don't want to get ahead of the data. We don't have the RCTs. RCTs will come. And don't worry about funding drying up for mental health research, because evolution is not optional. Petty tyrants and bad movements in politics come and go. Your work will contribute to the furtherance of human capacity. It will, so don't worry about the research money. It's going to be there. I guarantee it. The second thing you can do is you can now draw upon compassion work. You can train yourself to focus on all of these different capacities. And as we do, we can work to develop a flow of compassion so that in between the therapist and the client, all of these qualities can be trained in compassionate flexibility. So there's a flow between your compassionate mind and the client's compassionate mind. It's a flow from self to other and also from self to self. So CBS and our world communities can benefit from compassion and psychological flexibility, and our technologies being married as a community. Your clients and yourself as therapists can benefit. And the third part, which has yet to be done, and this is my request of you, I'm asking you for something. I'm asking you on behalf of the people you wished to help. In the beginning of this talk, you remembered someone who's suffering, you were moved by. You have clients, real people who depend on you, and you're real people. In the name of all of those people who are suffering, here's what I want you to do. Advance our understanding of how attachment, psychological flexibility, and compassion function. If you're a researcher, consider the role you can play in furthering this. If you're a clinician, learn. Because I really, 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 really believe that if we can put our minds to this initiative, a science that's better suited to furthering compassion and personal awakening is going to evolve. And it's just beautiful to be here, and it's beautiful to have this opportunity to share all this with you in this warm room. And we got through it. You did the magic trick. You bended time, and you got through the material we needed. So lots of love to you. Thanks very much for having me. Take care.